Good morning. We'll give it a couple minutes and then get started. Okay, good morning. We need a film here. There we go. Good morning. Today's daf in Masechet Bava Kamma, being recorded and live is daf Lamed Aleph. Daf Lamed Aleph, 31. And so we continue the discussion around a Mishnah at the top of daf Lamed Aleph, and the very interesting discussion about bor, right? The responsibility. Good morning. The responsibility of bar is a responsibility that if you have something that causes damage, that you sometimes have to pay for that. Now, of course, that seems in some ways very similar to shar. Shar is if you have an animal that causes damage, you have to pay for that. If you have a hole in the ground that causes damage, you got to pay for that. We've been discussing the differences between those two types of damage. One, of course, is very active. One seems a little bit more passive. But there's many other differences as well. And so today's Gemara gets into a conversation which we've already started. We're up to the Mishnah on the top of Daf Lamed Aleph. Shnei Kadarim. You have two Kadarim. Kadarim, I think, are potters, right? So Shayu Mahalchin Zeh Achar Zeh. And they are walking in single file down the street, down the Broadway. V'nitzgal HaRishon, the first one trips, he falls. V'nafal, right? And he falls down. And unfortunately, he breaks all his pots, right? But that's a problem for him. No one else is at fault. But then Nitzgal HaSheni B'Rishon. Then the second one bumps into the first one, which, of course, anyone who's driven before, any teenager who wants to dream about driving, this is the most common problem, right? The person in front of you gets into an accident and you crash into them. And so the second person who had a head full of pots fell into the first one. And of course, all of his pots broke, or he broke his arm. Says the Mishnah, Harishon Chayav B'Niskei Sheni. The first one has to pay the damages for the second one. Now, I'm going to introduce some concepts which we've talked about before, and the Gemara will talk about today, which is the question of why, right? Why does that first person hire for the second one? So there's two main categories, and we're going to see today that these are not such distinct categories. One is it's possible that there's something called Adam Hamazik, right? A person who causes damage is chayav, I need that tissue, is chayav for the damage they cause. So that whether you do it intentionally or unintentionally, remember we said before, Adam muad olam, person's always a muad. If I cause damage to you, whether I did it intentionally or not, I got to pay. Yeah. The other possibility is that if I fall in the street and I drop my pots and they all break and there's glass shattered across the road, that's a bar, right? I've caused a obstacle. And if you then fall in that obstacle, my bar caused you to fall. Now, one of the big distinctions between a dam hamazik and a bar that damages is, if you recall, there's a special halacha by bar that you're only chayav for a bar if animals fall into it, or maybe people, but not objects. So a bar, if a person has a bar and an animal falls into it and the animal dies, you got to pay. That's what the pasuk. But if an object falls into that bar, or the animal has an object on its back, then you're not chayav to pay for that, for kelim that fall in a bar. Okay, so that would be a big distinction. Now it says our Gemara, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, last narrow line, sorry. It says Rabbi Yochanan, Lo tema matnitin Rabbi Meir. You don't have to rely on saying that our Mishnah is Rabbi Meir, who says nitkal posheahu. If you recall earlier, we quoted this machloket, Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim, and Rabbi Meir said that if a person is walking in the road and they fall, that's considered to be negligence. Why? They didn't want to fall. But you've got to take normal precautions against falling. And if you fell, not because someone hit you, but because you just tripped, that's considered to be negligence on your part. And you're a poshea. Remember, the poshea is a person who is guilty, meaning that they didn't watch things properly. So you might have thought that the Mishnah is only going according to Rabbi Meir, and therefore the fact that you got into a car accident is your fault, right? And that's why you're chayev. Says Rabbi Yochanan, it's not the case, right? Ella afilu l'Rabbanan, even according to the Rabbanan who say the Amri anusu upatur, that a person who falls is considered to be an onus, and if on the way down they hit somebody, they're patur because it's totally out of their control. They didn't want to fall; it was a total accident. Even so, our Mishnah would say that you're chayev for the second person. You know why? Because you didn't hurt the second person when you fell. You hurt the second person by laying there on the street, you and your possessions, and the second person came crashing into you. So even though your falling was not your fault, the fact that you didn't get up is your fault, right? If you make an obstacle by falling in the street, so we don't blame you necessarily according to the Chachamim for the falling. You didn't want to do that. But the fact is you got to clear that up real quickly. And if you don't clear that up, you are responsible. And of course, this is super relevant, right? For all kinds of things that happen on the highway. A person gets into an accident. Do you pull your car over to the side of the road? Do you leave it in the middle of the road? Things fall off your car. How much do you get rid of them? So says Rabbi Yochanan, it's not just because you did something wrong by falling. It's even if we don't hold you guilty for falling, hacha you're chayav, the second wide line, shahaya lo la'amod v'lo amad. You should have gotten up and you didn't get up. Now, the super important implication of Rabbi Yochanan is that if you didn't have a chance to get up, you'd be patur, right? If this happened so quickly that you couldn't have done anything about it, then according to Rabbi Yochanan, no reason you should be chayev. It's not your fault for falling. You didn't have a chance to get up, and therefore you'd be patur. Says Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, I disagree. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak amar, afilu tema lo haya lo lamod. Even if you had no chance to get up, you would still be chayev. Why would you still be chayev? Because even if you can't get up, you could at least put up a warning sign, right? You could put up the yellow cones saying, don't come here, I had an accident, right? Haya lo lahas here, lo is here. You could have warned people. You could have screamed out, alert, be careful, I just fell, whatever you would say, warning. So you should have done that. And the fact that you didn't do that itself is mechayev you. And Rabbi Yochanan would say that's not enough. Kivan lo haya lo la'amod, lo haya lo lahazir did tarid. Because if you didn't have even a few minutes to get up, it's unreasonable to expect you to warn people. You're in shock, right? Every time, again, this is a very practical thing. If you get into an accident, something happens, it's not so much whether you physically can get up, it's whether you have your wits about you, right? And so says Rabbi Yochanan, if you didn't have enough time to get out of the situation, we can't expect you to start making announcements and telling people that you are able, that they should avoid the crash. And therefore, says Rabbi Yochanan, the reason you're chayiv, and we all agree with this, the reason you're chayiv in our Mishnah is not necessarily because you fell. It's because after you fell, you didn't solve the problem. And so once you are laying there, you are a mazik. Again, it's not clear. Are you the individual a mazik? Or are you the individual a bar, right? And the big implication would be, are you chayiv for kelim, right? Which we're going to continue to discuss. Says the Gemara, it's not. Let's look at our Mishnah. This is a Mishnah tomorrow. Tomorrow we'll have this Mishnah. The Mishnah on Amibet says a very interesting case where it's not two potters. It's where one person has a big beam on his shoulder. Now, again, this is very practical. If you've ever walked down the street carrying the sukkah or something, you know that it's very heavy and you constantly have to stop and readjust, right? And move around the way you're carrying it. So says the Mishnah tomorrow, it's none now. Hayo bal kora rishon. The first person in this procession is carrying a beam, right? And walking down the street. Ubal chavit acharon. And right behind him is a person carrying a barrel. Now, the person carrying the barrel is very impatient and he's rushing to go and he bumps into the beam and his barrel breaks. Says the Mishnah, nishbara chavit bikora. If the barrel breaks on the beam because the person holding the barrel rushes up and hits the beam, you're patur, right? The person holding the beam is patur because you drove like a maniac. It's not my problem. Vim amad bal korah chayav. But if the person holding the beam just stops in the middle of the street and the guy behind him, which happen again, these are car accidents all the time, right? The guy behind him just bumps into him and his barrel of wine breaks on the beam, then says the Mishnah, chayav. The person in front is chayav, right? The person holding the beam is chayav. Now, what does that have to do with our Mishnah? because there the beam didn't fall, but the fact that the beam is there is a damaging thing. So it's very similar to our Mishnah, where a person's pots fell on the ground, right? And then someone else tripped on those and fell. And remember, Rabbi Yochanan said in our Mishnah that it's not your fault necessarily for dropping the pots. We don't blame you. What we blame you for is not picking them up. So now think about the beam, right? It said you were carrying a beam, you walked down the street and you stopped. Now, when you stopped, was it your fault for stopping? Was it something wrong to stop? Was there a stop sign there, right? So they didn't have stop signs, but it was very common back in those days and today that if you're walking along with the beam, that it's normal for you to stop to readjust. And so if you're walking behind someone carrying a couch, right, it would be very foolish of you to assume they're going to keep walking and never stop. They're going to stop to rebalance it. And so the question is, why did they stop? If they stopped to rebalance it and you walked into them, why is it their fault? You should have anticipated that. So says the Gemara, it must be, right, my love, shaman lekatef. And presumably they stopped in order to rearrange it on their shoulders, meaning to rearrange the beam, which is a normal behavior. And we're saying that even so, right, to orchehu, which is a normal thing, and we're saying you're chayav, the tani you're chayav. Now, why would you be chayav, right? It's not, he's allowed to stop and readjust his beam. The reason you'd be chayav is because even though you're allowed to stop and adjust your beam, if you stop, you have to make an announcement. You have to put up flashing lights, right? And say, I'm stopped here, I'm readjusting. The Havi Leila Hazir. So you see, unlike Rabbi Yochanan, that even where you have no expectation that the person won't do this, right? You have no chance to get up and move because you got to adjust your couch. But the fact is, you're supposed to warn people. It's more low. It's not necessarily the reason you're chayav because you had to warn people. It's talking about a case where you stopped to get lunch, right? Which is unusual. You don't just stop in the middle of the Henry Hudson Parkway, stop your truck and say, I got to go take a bathroom break, right? That's not usual. Kishamad lafosh, you stop to unload, right? Again, in the middle of the street, which is unusual. You're not supposed to unload your weight in the middle of the street. So that's why you're chayav, because what you did was you stopped in an unusual way. Therefore, the people behind you could not have anticipated that, and you're chayav for the damage. So what would that imply? Aval amanda katef my patur. That in fact, if you had stopped for a legitimate reason to readjust your load, you would be patur. You wouldn't be chayav because you didn't do the thing wrong. So then, if that's true, why didn't the Mishnah make that distinction? Right? The Mishnah always loves to say, if you do this, you're chayav, but if you do it this way, you're patur. So at the Tani Seifa, the end of the Mishnah tomorrow will say, quote now, if you tell the person behind you, stop, because I'm stopping, then you'd be patur if they didn't listen to you. But why do you have to have that case? Make a distinction in the exact same case where you're walking, you stop, you don't say anything, and say, when are you chayav? That you're chayav kishamad lafosh. If you stop to unload, which is an unusual act. If you stop to readjust your load, which is a normal act, you'd be patur, right? So why did we have to go to a new case to say you'd be patur if you announced it? You'd even be patur if you didn't announce it, as long as you were stopping for a legitimate reason, according to Rabbi Yochanan. Says, well, you're right. Rabbi Yochanan says that's true. That the reason the Mishnah told you this case where you announced it, because that's an even bigger chiddush. Hakamash Milan, the chiddush of the Mishnah is the afagav damad lafosh. Even if you stop to unload your thing to go stop and get lunch, and you're in the middle of the road, which is totally wrong to do, it's illegitimate, you're still patur if you announce it. If you said to the person behind you, to the traffic behind you, stop because I am stopping, then you'd be patur even if what you stopped for was not something you're allowed to do or supposed to do in public. So that's a big chiddush of the Mishnah, and that's why the Mishnah told us the chiddush. But according to Rabbi Yochanan, again, if it was not your fault, right, you stopped for a legitimate reason to readjust the couch because it was too heavy, and you didn't have an opportunity to keep going again, if someone bumped into you, you would be patur, just like if you tripped and you had no chance to get up again and they fell over you, you'd be patur. Tashma. Let's try to prove this from another brighter. We're around midway through this short daf, this short amud at least. Tashma. Hakadarim v'hazagagim. This is going to consume us for the rest of today. So pay a lot of attention. Kadarim and zagagim. Now, kadarim and zagagim are, I don't know how you translate kadarim, sorry, but zagagim are glass blowers, Rashi says. And kadarim are similar. They're potters.
Yeah.
Right? Kadar. Yeah, like we had in the first mission. Sorry. I know exactly how to translate it. They're fine pottery and glass. Okay. Now, if you make fine pottery and glass, you have to not worry about just making it, but you have to worry about transporting it, right? Because if you're walking down the street with your glass and an animal comes crashing into you, not only will you get hurt, but your glass is all going to break. So these were very delicate, right? They were the people move the pianos, right? The fine movers. So the Kadarim and the Zagagim, they are walking down the road on a little convoy, right? So you have 5 glass blowers walking down the road. It sounds like a good story. And of course, what happens is the first one trips. Nitkala Rishon v'nafal, and he falls down. And as would happen in any good comedy, the second one falls over the first one, right? Nitkala sheni b'rishon, and then of course the third one falls on the second one. Shlishi b'sheni. Okay, so you got a chain reaction, as we call it. A little chemistry here, right? So all these people fall and they get damaged. Says the Braita, Rishon chayav b'niskei sheni. Remember, the first one, no one's high for the first one. He fell on his own. There's no blame there. But he fell for number one, Rishon, and the second one fell over the first one. So the first one has to pay for the damages caused to the second one. You got it? It's his fault. It's like our Mishnah. Sheni chayav b'niskei shlishi. The second one has to pay for the damage to the third one, etc., etc., etc. Okay, and now we don't exactly know why that is yet, right? What's the second one do wrong? He just fell over the first guy. So we're going to see in a second that we presume that's because he should have gotten up, right? Falling is not his fault, but not getting up is his fault, like our Mishnah. Says the Braita though, im machmat rishon naflu, rishon chayav. If they all fell for the first one, the Gemara is going to say later, that's like if the first one fell and covered the whole road, so no one can get by, then the first one's high for everyone, but it's kula. Okay, and finishes the Braita, vim his hirud zad peturin. But if they warned each other, then you're putter. Meaning, if the first one screamed out and said, "Alert, alert, I fell," and it's enough time for the second one to stop, but he doesn't, then the first one would be putter. And the same thing would be true about the second and the third, and you could have 20 people on this chain reaction. Now, why are they chayav? Right? Why is the second one chayav for the third one? My love, we are assuming that we're talking even about a case shelo haya lahem la'amod, right? That it's talking about a case even where they had no chance to get up, and so the second one fell over the first one. He had no chance to pick up all his glass and all his wares across the road and himself before the third guy came along and fell over him. So why is the second one chayav if he didn't have a chance to get up? It must be because he should have warned them, unlike Rabbi Yochanan. So this is a question of Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says that if you couldn't have gotten up, you should be putter. But we're assuming this means every case. No, it doesn't mean that. Lo, shaya lahem la'amod. It's talking about a case where the second one could have gotten up. He didn't. He was in no rush. He was nursing his wounded elbow, and he waited around, and then the third guy came along and tripped over him. Says, okay, if that's true, then you should have made that distinction. Avolo haya lahem la'amod my peturim. What would it be if you had no chance to get up, and you laid there on the ground, and you had no chance to get up. So you laid on the ground because you couldn't get up, then you'd be putter. So again, ihachi, so at the Tani Seifa, before the Seifa says, im his hero zad peturin, that if they warn each other, they're putter, you don't even need to come on to a new case. Why don't you make a distinction in the exact same case as the Reisha? That the Reisha said, you're chayav, but we should have finished and said, when are you chayav, shahaya lahem la'amod? If you had a chance to get up and you didn't get up, so the next one came and tripped on you, it's your responsibility for laying in the middle of the public with your broken glass and your broken pots, and therefore causing a hazard. Aval lo haya lahem la'amod peturin. But if you didn't have a chance to get up, you'd be putter. So why didn't we say that case? Why do we have to announce? Why do we have to say a new case where if you could have announced it, you'd be putter for that? That's smart, because again, it's the same chiddush we just said, that it's true according to Rabbi Yochanan. If you couldn't have gotten up, you'd be putter. But we're telling you another chiddush, that even if you could have gotten up, but you didn't, if you announced and put up cones and said there's a hazard ahead, then you'd be putter. Even though you could have gotten up, you're still putter. If you warned each other, then you'd be putter, because you gave, again, it has to be ample warning, where they could have stopped, then you'd be putter. So that is Rabbi Yochanan's halacha. It's a very important halacha. It is probably the way we paskin, because we like paskin like Rabbi Yochanan.
feel like in certain cases.
I'm sorry, actually, it looks like we don't paskin that way. So maybe we don't paskin that way, but it's important. The halacha of Rabbi Yochanan is that you're only chayav if you had a chance to get up. If you didn't have a chance to get up, you're patur. According to the other opinion of Rabbi Nachman bar Yitzchak, even if you couldn't get up, you're chayav if you could have warned and you didn't warn. But everybody here seems to agree, and we're going to question this in a second, that just falling is not your fault. The problem is that you didn't get up. And because you didn't get up, someone else fell on top of you, and therefore you're chayav. Now, says Rava, we're 4 lines from the bottom. Amar Rava. Now, as I said yesterday, this is a very complex statement of Rava. There's a huge debate about what he means. Therefore, we have a short daf because Tosfos and Rashi go to town discussing this. But Rava points out that this is much more complicated than you realize. Because when you think about it, the person number 1 fell, right? Person number 2 fell on top of person number 1. So first of all, there's 2 questions. Well, there's 4 questions, right? The questions are, who caused the damage to person number 2, and what was the damage that they caused? Right? Person number 1 fell, and his pots fell, and his glass is strewn all over the street. Person number 2 fell, and his glass fell also, right? So presumably you could have caused damage to a person. You could have caused damage to his glass. Why does that matter? It matters because if you recall, a bar, right, for a pit, you're only chayav for damage to people and animals, not damage to objects. So if the first person is a pit, basically, right, is a bar, then they shouldn't be chayav for the glass of the second person. They should only be chayav for the damage to the second person, right? Now, if the first person is an adam hamazik, they're a human causing damage, they should be chayav for both, right? That's the person. But what about the person's glass, right? If the first person fell and his glass fell, his glass then tripped up the second person. The second person stepped on his glass. Glass can't be an adam hamazik. It presumably has to be a bar, right? Now, of course, there's a third option because glass could be a shor. It could be your property causing damage, right? So it doesn't have to be, it's obviously not an adam. It might not be a bar. It might be an actual damager itself. So if the glass hurt the second person, are you chayav? And if the glass hurt the second person's glass, are you chayav? Right? If it's a bar, you would be patur because bars are not chayav for kalim, but it might be chayav for an adam. But if it's considered a thing that caused damage, you might be chayav for both. So says Rava. Let me just explain this all to you. And again, what Rava says doesn't make a ton of sense. We're going to explain it. That says Rava now 3 lines from the top bottom. Right? Pay close attention. Says Rava Rishon, the first person who fell. Chayav b'niskei sheni. They are chayav in damage caused to the second person. And that is bein b'niskei gufo, whether damage to the person of the second guy, bein b'niskei mimono, or whether it's damage to the property of the second person. Now Rashi understands, Tosfos here speaks it out very nicely, so you don't even have to turn the page because he agrees with Rashi's pshat, that what we're saying here is that you're chayav, if the first person damages the second person, he's chayav. If the first person damages the second person's objects, he's chayav. If the first person's objects damage the second person, he's chayav. All 3 of those. The 4th case, you're not chayav. If the first person's objects damage the second person's objects, then you wouldn't be chayav. But that's true about the first person. But the second person, sheni, chayav b'niskei shlishi, the second one, which our Mishnah says is chayav in the third one, that's only niskei gufo. That's only if the person damaged the other person or his objects damaged the other person. Avalo b'niskei mimono, but not damage that was done to the objects of the third person. So there's a big distinction, says Rava, between person number 1 and person number 2, even though our Brisa didn't make that distinction, right? Our Brisa said that number 1 has to pay for number 2 has to pay for number 3, etc. Says Rava, that's not true across the board. It's true that the first one is chayav for both. And we're going to see why. We blame the first one in a bigger way than the second guy. The second one is only chayav b'niskei gufo, but not niskei mimono, only for damage caused to a person. Maybe that's one reading. The other reading is only damage caused by his person and not damage caused by his money. Ask him, why is that true? I don't understand it. Why is there any difference between the first person and the second person? If you say that a person falling is a fool, an idiot, and they're responsible for their actions, then sheni nami l'chayev. then the second one should be just as chayiv as the first one. The fact that you fell, you shouldn't fall. You got to watch where you're going. The init galav poshehu, if falling is not considered to be pshia, not considered to be negligence, and it's just an accident that happens, so then why would you blame the first one any more than the second one? So rishon nami lipatar, the first one should also be pater. So this is a question. Why, turn the page, why is there any difference between the first one and the second? Says the Gemara on the top of Daf Lamed Aleph Amud Bet, the reason there's a difference is the following. Rishon vadai poshehu. The first one is for sure negligent. You're walking down the street and you fall. That's considered to be abnormal behavior, right? It's like driving into a tree, right? We always say if you drive into a tree, either you were drunk or you fell asleep or you did something wrong, but there's no excuse. Now, again, there's occasionally could be like a medical excuse or something, but we consider that to be pshia. If you just stumble with no provoking thing, you're guilty. That's the first guy. Now, the second guy, Shani, the second guy is a little bit less guilty because he stumbled over the first one. So therefore, says the Gemara, Gufo mechayav, he's chayav for any damage caused by his body. Why? Because after he fell, sure, it wasn't his fault that he fell because he fell over the first guy. But hayalola amad v'lo amad, he should have stood up and he didn't stand up. Or if you don't like Rabbi Yochanan, he should have announced and he didn't announce. So he's still chayav for damage he causes. But amimono patur. But for his broken glass, he's patur. The Amar Lekes, he can say, Hi bira lava nakariti. This pit, I didn't dig it. Meaning my glass is a pit, right? It's a hazard, but I didn't cause it to fall. I was tripped by the first guy. And since I didn't cause it to fall, and I have no more interest in my broken glass lying on the road, so I'm mafkir it, therefore I am patur for what it caused. Now you're going to ask, why isn't the first guy, can't he say the same thing? And the reason the first guy can't say the same thing is because he was posheya, right? So imagine if I walk into the street and drop nails on Henry Hudson Parkway, right, which I'm looking at, and then say, you know what, I don't really want those nails anymore. I'm mafkir them, right? Because I don't want to pick them up. I'm not patur because I caused that through negligence. But if I drop them by accident, then I would be patur. And so therefore, the first one is considered to be responsible for his actions of his kalim. The second one is not considered to be responsible. But for their personal actions, they're all responsible. Okay? That's how we understand Rava right now. I've oversimplified, but I think it's great for the purposes. Meitve. Ask the Gemara, what about the following Breita that seems to argue with Rava? And remember, Rava cannot argue with the Breita. The Breita says, quote now, Kulan. Now we think Kulan means when there's a chain reaction of people and you've got, person 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All of them are chayavin on iske gufan. They're all chayav on damage caused by their own body, but because they should have gotten up and they didn't get up. Upaturin on iske mimomnan. But they're patur on any damage caused by their broken glass. Now that goes against Rava, because Rava said the first one has to pay for damage caused by their broken glass. So Ma'alav Afilu Rishon, when we say Kulan, we mean all of them. Presumably we mean even the first one. Says no, that's not what Kulan means. Kulan means Levad Mi Rishon, all of them except for the first one. Well, that's a pretty silly thing to say, all of them, when you mean all of them except for one. Says Kulam Katani. Well, you said all of them. Amar V'Adam Rava. What we mean by Kulan, meaning Kulan, all of the victims, Kulan Anizakin, all of those who were damaged by the first fool who fell down, number 2, 3, 4, 5, the whole chain reaction, all of them is what we mean. Not all of the people from number 1, but all the people after number 1. So it's more, well, that's a little bit of an explanation, but not very sufficient. Because if you're saying a chiddush, that you're telling me even the first one is patur for their money, or their objects, then where am I? Hainu diktani kulan. That's why you would say all of them. Eliyamr levar mi rishon my kulan. So why would you say the word kulan? Why would you use that description litzni hanizakim? There's nothing added by saying all of them. You should have just said those who were damaged. And so that does not seem to be a good explanation. And so we now have a Breita which seems to go against Rava, right? Because what Rava said, shockingly, is that there's a difference between the first guy who falls and everybody else who falls. That the first one who falls, not only is his body chayav for damage it causes, but his objects are chayav. Because he made a bar through negligence, and you made mechayav him. The second one made a bar by accident, and therefore he's patur for the objects, right? For the bar. Says the Gemara now, Ela Amar Rava, around 10 lines from the top. You know the way it is. What I meant to say was the following. Rishon, the first one, right? The first guy who fell, where am I? Chayav bein beniskei gufo disheni, bein beniskei mimono disheni. The first one who fell, if he then hurt the second guy, he broke his leg, or he broke the glass of the second guy, he's got to pay for either one because his body is adama mazik. Whether he damaged a person or damaged objects, you've got to pay. Okay, where am I? So then you got to pay. Shani, the second guy who has to pay for the third guy, he's only chayav b'niskei shlishi b'niskei gufa. He's only chayav for hurting the third guy for physical damage to his body. Avalo b'niskei mimono, but not for damaging the third guy's glass. So if the second guy fell down on the ground and the third person came along and tripped over him and broke his leg, the second one would have to pay for that damage. But if when he broke his leg, he dropped his glass and it all shattered on the ground, the second one doesn't have to pay for the third one's glass. The first one has to pay for the second one. Why doesn't the second one have to pay? My taima, says Rava, the havile bar, because the second guy is not an adam hamazik. He's a bar, right? He turned into an obstacle. And lo matzinu bar shechayev bo atakilim. You never have a bar that has to pay for damage to kelim. So the first one who fell is the person who caused damage by falling, basically. And therefore he's an adam mazik, and an adam has to pay for the second one's person and the second one's possessions. But the second guy or the third guy or the fifth guy, they, by falling and not getting up, have turned themselves into a bar, and therefore they're chayav for people or even animals who fell over them, but they're not chayav for damage to kelim. Says Gemara, it's a little bit strange. How do you call a person a bar? So Hanichal is Shmuel, who we've had last week several times. Damar kol takala baru. Shmuel is the one who says that a bar is really just another word for an obstacle. A bar is not a pit. A bar is any kind of obstacle. So this person became an obstacle. But according to Rav, remember, Rav said that a bar is something that you don't own, right? Remember, a bar has to be in public. And Rav said a bar has to be hefker. It's not an obstacle. It's an obstacle that you don't own. If it's an obstacle that you do own, what is it then? It's a shor. It's a mazik, right? So if it's your fault. Ella l'Rav to Amar in that if you made your bar hefker, it becomes a bar ilolo. But if you didn't make it hefker, you didn't make it unowned, ownerless, then it's not a bar. My ikelamemer, because obviously a person cannot be mafker themselves. Just to be clear, right? You can't say, okay, I no longer own myself, right? Obviously, the fact that you fell and you're lying across the road and 50 people are coming running and are going to trip over you, according to Rav, you can't be a bar. According to Shmuel, sure, you could be a bar, right? But if you fell negligently, as long as it was your fault. But according to Rav, why are you a bar? Ella, says the Gemara, la'olam, you added the word Ella, la'olam, k'da amri meikara. You know what? It's the way we said it initially. That what Rava was saying, in fact, was not the person, but the objects of the person and the person, right? That when a person falls, their objects cause damage, his objects cause damage, then he's chayav. When the second one falls, the objects are not chayav because they're a bar. So, sorry, they're his objects that damage other objects would be putter because a bar, you'd be putter on kelim. We had a question. It said in the Braita, everybody, right? It said kulam. And if according to Rava, there's a difference between the first one and the second one. So how could you say all of them? Says the Gemara, the way you have to explain that is the kashalan kulan chayavim, right? You're bothered by the words that say everybody. Tirgamar of Adabra Menume Kamei Ravina, Vadabra Menume, and Father Ravina came up with a brilliant answer. Shehusku kelim bikelim. That is talking about a case where the objects damaged other objects. And there, in fact, it is true. That, remember, now I'm going to go back for a second. According to the final way we're coming out, according to Rava, if the first guy falls, Ruvain, right, Rishon falls, and his body causes damage to the second guy or to the glass of the second guy, he's chayav. And if he causes damage through his kalim to the second guy, he's chayav. But if his kalim, the first one's kalim, cause damage to the second one's kalim, then you're potter. And the same would be true about the second one. Where the second one fell, if his body caused damage, he'd be chayav. If his kalim caused damage, he'd be potter. right? He's less chayav than the first one, because the first one would be chayav even if his kalim caused damage to the body of the other person. But according to the second one, would be patur if his kalim caused damage to the body of the third person. But it's true when we say kulan or paturin that if the kalim of the first one, or the second one, or the third one, or the fifth one, caused damage to the kalim of the next one, you'd be patur in all those cases, because the kalim are only a bar. And remember, a bar, you'd always be patur for causing damage to somebody else's kalim, not their actual body. So that is how we conclude. According to the way I read it, of course, there's many other ways to read it. Now, the final point for today, if you aren't all lost already, is that our Mishnah said, the Braita said, that if the first one falls and the second one bumps into them, the second one is paid by the first one. The third one falls into the second guy has to pay the third guy. We said, except if they all fall due to the first one. So what does that mean? Continues Amar Mar, Im machmat rishon naflu, if they all fell due to the first one, rishon chayav, b'niskei kulam. The first one has to pay the damage for all of them. Says Gemara, how's that possible, right? First guy fell, the second one fell on the first one, the third one fell on the second one. So what do you mean they fell for the first one? Hechi mishkachat, machad rishon hechi nafal. Sorry, how'd they fall due to the first one? If Papa says, no. What happened was, the paske le'orche kishalda. You blocked the whole road like a shalda. A sheled, Rashi says, is a dead body, right? That like an avela, that just basically you were a dead meat across the whole road. So you basically didn't just fall in one lane, you fell and blocked the whole road. And so the third guy tried to get around the second one, but ended up falling on the first one again. So that's when you're chayav, and that's one explanation. And Rav Zvin Amar kichutra de siyumta. They were talking about where you fell like a stick of a blind person, right? So what Rashi sort of explains is that when you're a blind person, you can't just walk along with your stick. You have to put it out and sweep in front of you to look for any fire hydrants or children, right? Or pedestrians. So therefore, basically, when you fell, not only did you fall in place, but you spread out all over the place, and therefore you contributed to a much bigger issue, and that's why you're chayav. Tosas says that they're arguing the first case, right? Because we're talking about, but anyways, it's an argument. But the bottom line is, either way, it's where the first one fell and caused damage beyond where they fell. That's where they're chayav for everything. And when it's a chain reaction, then the first one's only chayav for the second guy, and the third one's chayav for the second one's chayav for the third for the fourth. And again, the way we concluded is that falling is considered to be pshi'ah, right? You should not have fallen. And you're chayav in the second case because you should have gotten up and moved, or at least provided a warning. And so this is a very complicated case where the first one did a pshiyah and is chayav for falling and for what their objects break. The second one is chayav for their own body because they should have gotten up, but they're not chayav for their things that broke because that's a bar, and the bar basically, well, you're not chayav at least for damage to other objects because it's not your fault, and therefore it may or may not be a bar for other people. We'll stop here at the Mishnah.
And Rabbi Yochanan was saying that everyone was patur?
Rabbi Yochanan,
in the beginning?
Rabbi Yochanan was saying, if you have no opportunity to get up or to move or to alert people, then you would be patur, right?
The Mishnah said chayav, though. The beginning of the Mishnah said chayav.
Right, so Rabbi Yochanan said you're only chayav because you could have stood up, right? So the Mishnah said you're chayav in a circumstance where you fell, but then you had an opportunity to fix that, and because you didn't fix it, you're chayav. But should you have had no opportunity, if you had it immediately, right? And this is like obviously driving down the road where the first car got into an accident, let's say, the second one hit the first one, the third one hit the second one. It was impossible for the second person to do anything different, right? Once they crashed. So then, according to Rabbi Yochanan and our Gemara, the second one guy would be patur for damaging the third person because he had no opportunity to stop the third person from crashing into him.
And the first person would also be patur.
Well, so it depends on the circumstances of the first person, right? Why they fell. So if they got into a crash sort of on their own because they were not paying attention, and then they would be chayav for the second one. Because it was their fault. Remember, the nitkal was posheya. If they got into an accident because someone hit them, right, then obviously it's a whole different story. But generally, the first one would be chayav. The second one would only be chayav if they could have stopped it, meaning they could have gotten up after they fell and they didn't get up.
But the first one would have been patur if he couldn't get up, according to Rabbi Yochanan.
No, so according to Rabbi Yochanan, the first, oh, so that's a good question. So according to Rabbi Yochanan, yes, if the first one could not have gone up and the second person crashed into him, he'd be putter potentially.
So
That's
he's explaining the well, he's sort of disagreeing with the Mishnah, or is he explaining?
no,
Oh,
no.
he's
He's explaining the Mishnah. He can't disagree with the Mishnah,
right.
right?
So is it,
So Rabbi Yochanan is saying that our Mishnah could remember. So there's a machloket about between Tanaim, between Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim, that if somebody falls, is that considered to be a pshia and therefore they're chayav, or is that an onus? It's forced and therefore they're patur, right? So that's a machloket Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim. What Rabbi Yochanan came to tell us is that don't think our Mishnah, which says you're chayav, is only going according to Rabbi Meir, who says that you're guilty for falling. Even according to the Chachamim, who say falling is not your fault, right? If you fall, it's not your fault. But if you didn't get up, it is your fault, right? So our Mishnah would potentially be saying, even though you fell and that's not your problem, the fact that you didn't stand up immediately afterwards is your problem, and therefore you're chayav for people crashing into you.
mm-hmm.
But according to Rabbi Meir, you'd be chayav no matter what, right? Because falling itself is considered to be your fault. But Rabbi Yochanan is adding that even according to the Chachamim, who say that falling is not is a mistake. It's not something we hold you liable for. We would hold you liable in our Mishnah if you didn't get up after you fell.
Unless you couldn't get up.
Unless you didn't have time to get up. Correct. Okay. Yeshikoch, everyone. I think Dov is doing tomorrow. Pick it up from the Mishnah.
No, it's not. It says canceled tomorrow.
Oh, no. I'm sorry to hear that. Okay.
The email does indeed say not meeting Monday and Tuesday.
I don't know if there's a recording being made. I'll ask that question and we'll put it up. Okay, everyone. Have a good week. Shavua Tov.